Everyone says, don't overwater your plants. But here's the weird thing. This plant gets watered daily, and this one gets watered once a week. It has been watered once in the last week. However, this is the one that is struggling and might potentially die. The real problem isn't water, it's actually oxygen. Let's dive into it. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see somewhere behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So yes, in today's video we're going to dive into a bit more about the notion of overwatering and actually why a lot of the times it's actually the oxygen that's the problem. Water has very little to do with it, or at least not directly, but it's actually the plant's roots suffocating. So in this video, we'll talk about why these plant roots can actually suffocate, why the soil type or the growing media is more important than how often you water, why some plants can sit in water almost forever with things like semi-hydro, and how to design a potting mix, a soil mixture, a growing media in a way that makes it almost impossible to overwater. But let's start with one of the biggest houseplant care myths. The fact that overwatering a lot of the times is misdiagnosed. So for example, I've got a plant here. This is a Syngonium strawberry milkshake, I think. I'll add it at the top there. But this is a plant that has been struggling for a while. This has gone through different bouts of root rot and it has been used in different bits of soil media as well. But this myth generally tends to put things like the fact that most plant deaths are attributed to overwatering. It's always the thing that we always hear, is just that, oh, you're an overwaterer, you've got much higher risks of actually causing root death through root rot because you're an overwaterer. But the thing that people a lot of the times tend to forget, that watering is only part of that equation. But as myself and a lot of other content creators have said for a very long time now, watering is only part of the equation. Yes, your plants need to be watered, but their roots also need oxygen. So water and oxygen. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about how rainforest soils are as well, because a lot of the time things that people forget is that the rainforest floor, or where a lot of these plants are actually growing, if they are terrestrial plants, tends to be consisting mainly of debris. It's dead leaves, branches that have fallen down, all these things, which makes it super, super airy. I obviously don't need to tell you this if you're growing an epiphytic plant, because you know that they are growing in not very much soil, if soil at all for that matter. It tends to be a lot of debris within the nooks and crannies of trees as they are climbing up to reach the light. So what do roots actually need? And I've got like a probably has a bit of like dust on it, but basically a clear plastic pot, or a cup in this case, but imagine this was a clear plastic pot with some soil mix inside it, and you can kind of see a lot of the things that roots will kind of need. So you can see it's very, very chunky, and you can see large air gaps that are happening around that soil structure. This provides a place where that oxygen can be available to those roots. And the reason why these roots need that oxygen within those little air pockets, which is why you want it chunky. Because if you imagine, if everything's the same size, it just turns into, I think the easiest example I can give you is think of a sandy beach. So the moment that you dig a hole in like sand, the rest of the sand covers it up and it becomes a very dense media. I know there's going to still be air between all those different structures of the sand. If you want to think of it in more kind of gardening terms, if you've got a very, very dense soil, even if you kind of move things around, there's still not going to be a lot of air available to some of those roots. And this is why boggy conditions means that there's very little air happening, because there's none of these gaps for the roots to be able to exchange gases. And gas exchange is something very simple. We see it happening a lot of the time on the leaves of plants. And this is something that we've all become a bit more accustomed to. We know that when a plant is exchanging gases, they are releasing oxygen and pulling in carbon dioxide, which is what they need for photosynthesis. But a lot of people tend to forget that roots also have an exchange of gases that are happening. So it does mean that they need air to be available around them, basically. And let's just touch on that gas exchange that is happening at the roots, because a lot of people don't always make that connection. So again, based on the research that I've done, the photosynthesis that is happening on the leaves is what we were talking about before. They pull in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen because it is photosynthesizing. With the roots, because the roots don't photosynthesize, they just need a gas exchange to happen for cellular respiration. And in simple terms, it means that the roots need oxygen, they pull in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. Conversely, the leaves do the opposite. So it is highly important that the roots have got access to kind of air that is happening around them in order to happen for that gaseous exchange to happen. But let's talk about the real cause, which is root suffocation. This is the real issue here. So again, remember we're talking about the gaseous exchanges. You need to think about potentially what the soil media is in terms of freshness. So this is unused soil media, and you can see all of the little gaps that are happening within the soil. And I'm going to show you my little, like, believe it or not, this is a plant that's doing something with roots. I was seeing roots growing on this recently. No, it's still there. So this is a forgetii, but this soil, and this is the anthurium soil mix, so this was already quite a chunky one, but you can see that, and I know it's wet, but that is a lot more dense at the moment than this is. So you need to also remember that things like the age of the soil is going to be important here, because you're going to start thinking about compaction, because over a while, whatever growing media we're using, especially if it's organic media, because it's constantly going through a wet and dry cycle, at some point it's going to start degrading or disintegrating, which means that those lovely air gaps that we've got there are going to be collapsing within themselves. So it's not a case of, oh, I've repotted my plant now, it's fine, the roots aren't circling, I'm going to leave it there until I see that it's struggling because it's getting root bound. Because what you might not be paying attention to is the fact that that soil is slowly compacting. The plant doesn't get a chance to start becoming root bound to then need the up pot and the fresher soil, because it's starting to rot, not because you're necessarily just overwatering, but because your overwatering is causing that soil media to become denser and denser and denser. Things are breaking down, the air gaps are disappearing, everything is compacting, it's not nice, fresh and fluffy soil anymore. And it means that that oxygen becomes less and less available to the roots, because those big air gaps that within the soil media, the fresh soil media, have become smaller and smaller and smaller, almost to the point that at some point they become practically not there anymore. So that will cause suffocation in the roots. And it is why people need to start considering not just plants being root bound as a reason for repotting, but also what is happening with the growing media. So a lot of people, I'll give you an example, people that have been growing orchids for a very long period of time, one of the things that they know, because this is the thing that they have to deal with, and if they don't, it will cause problems, is that because things like orchids, a lot of the orchids, especially the ones with the chunkier roots, are just growing in something that's very airy. So this is just an orchid bark with a whole bunch of air holes. This soil media, generally speaking, most people that are growing these types of orchids would still be repotting this every couple of years to introduce new bark within there, get rid of some of that kind of rotting bark, because the longer you leave this, the more that bark degrades, decomposes, and just becomes dust, and it becomes denser and denser and denser, and then you start getting rot within orchid roots. So they've been doing this for a while. It's something that the houseplant world as a whole, that maybe isn't growing orchids, is taking a bit longer to learn. So let's talk about the soil structure, which is always a bit of a hidden factor with all this. So I want you to kind of imagine, I'll see if I can get any videos or pictures to kind of put up this section so you can kind of see it as well. So imagine something really dense, like a dense peat mixture. And I know most of, at least in the UK, I'm assuming most of Europe now is moving away from peat mixes for houseplants, and they're trying to not touch peat as much as possible, not just for houseplants. I think this is generally for like gardening as well. But that tends to be very, very dense at time, very little airflow that is happening because of the media itself and the materials that are within the media. Now think of something like a chunky aroid soil mix, and this is Soil Ninja's Anthurium soil mix. So this is exceptionally chunky. You can kind of see like nothing is clumping together, and I know it's dry, but if I was to kind of like drop this all down, you can see that it's all falling down as if it was just pebbles, basically. Then you need to think about bark mixtures, and the important thing to remember here is how big are your bark chunks as well, or how small. For example, there was a point where I was trying to get like regular kind of medium to large size orchid bark, and it's interesting because I went to buy some the other day as well, and I still couldn't find anybody that had it in stock. So I don't know if there's like a shortage at the moment, but there is a lot more of the very, very fine orchid bark that is happening. You need to remember that the size of the chunks is going to matter as well, because if something is small, small particles can fit next to each other a lot closer. So those air gaps start to become smaller and smaller and smaller. If something is chunky with something else that's chunky, you get bigger air gaps, which is preferable. And then think about something like leca, or any form of semi-hydro mix. I'm using leca because it's kind of really obvious and really big chunky bits. If you were to see this in a clear pot, you could see that things don't sit neatly. Yes, these are little kind of balls, but you can see that big gaps are going to be created amongst those big balls, which means that you're going to get a lot of airflow that's coming in. That's the slight difference between something like this. I know there's more nuanced differences as well, but between this and the orchid bark, obviously orchid bark is organic, this is inorganic. So there is that to remember as well there. But orchid bark is going to be all different irregular shapes and sizes. So you might get bigger gaps, smaller gaps. With the leca, you tend to get more uniform gaps while still remaining quite large. And I do know that you can get leca in different sizes nowadays. If you even think about a couple of years back, you just had one size of leca, which is what everybody used. Now you can get small leca sizes, big leca sizes, this medium kind of standard size. So there is a size for everybody. And we need to remember that pot choice matters as well. So things are going to be very different in the different pots you're going to be using. So potentially you could have a plastic nursery pot. You might have a clear pot. You might have a clear plastic pot with drainage holes. There's also got big drainage holes at the bottom because this is meant for orchids. You could have whatever plastic pot you have in something like a decorative cache pot. So that means that there's going to be less air. Or you could have something like a terracotta pot, or, and this obviously terracotta pot, I don't need to tell you, is a lot better at kind of leaching out some of that moisture as well. Now, you could also have something like net pots, which has got a large amount of kind of air holes that are coming through. This is going to be the most airy solution that you have, unless you are mounting something directly onto like a cork board with a tiny bit of sphagnum moss. That's going to have the, or even without the sphagnum moss, just directly onto a cork board, which you might do with some orchids, that's going to have the maximum amount of air around it. But you can kind of see there's going to be different options, and there's going to be different ways that certain pots might help, certain pots might hinder, or decorative pots, and some other pots might sit somewhere in between. You also, and I'm bringing up the terracotta again, you need to think about things like evaporation as well, not just from the top of the soil, because that is the problem with a lot of the plastic pots, even something like this, which is a clear pot with a lot of holes on the side of it. This is going to allow air to evaporate predominantly around where these holes are, in not a huge deal as well, but usually just at the top. With something like a terracotta pot, however, the whole pot itself is going to be leaching out the water as well, which means that that water and that moisture is not going to be staying near the roots for too long, which means that whatever holes were being filled up with moisture, especially if you may be overwatering, are going to be released because they are coming through the actual porous material that is terracotta. Even more so with something like a net pot, because at this point, you can see that if I had a plant in here, the soil level up here, yes, you'd get some evaporation that's happening from the moisture that's within that soil at the top, but also there is so many holes around this. And if you've got anything like a fan blowing around, forget about it. You're going to get even more evaporation that is happening from all of these kind of holes that are being created by the net itself. And I hear all of you, before you even say it, they're just like, but Memo, how does this work with semi-hydro? With a lot of the times you get the roots actually sitting within water. So for instance, if this was a plant in semi-hydro, so this has got leca in it, it's a clear pot, just I'm using it for kind of display example now. And imagine that this saucer was the water reservoir. If the plant was up here, anybody who's grown in semi-hydro will know that the roots eventually will go down through the pot and they'll come out from whatever drainage holes you might have and end up within that water media that's directly there. That is different. And you're sitting there going, well, how does that not cause issues with watering as well? And how does that not cause issues with air reaching the roots? But you also need to remember what is happening up here. Let me bring that up again so you can kind of see. Can you see those big air gaps that are happening? So a lot of the roots that are still within that growing pot, and I'm using, this is a bad example because this is a tiny pot. Imagine a much bigger pot with semi-hydro. It doesn't have to be leca, it could be pond, it could be whatever you're using for your semi-hydro. There's a lot of air that's happening within that particles that we were talking about before, about the size particles, that is there and facilitating that exchange of gases. It means that oxygen diffusion will happen throughout all those little kind of nooks and crannies that the roots can go into that are not constantly being hugged by soil medias or more dense soil medias. For example, and this is a good example with leca, some of this is a porous material as well, so that itself doesn't hold that much water and it's also got little nooks and crannies within the material itself, which can also help to kind of keep some of that oxygen there available for the actual roots. And then you need to think about the difference between a water reservoir and saturation. And I do hear you, because a lot of our kind of beloved plants that we can grow, a lot of people will just water propagate something and just leave it in water and that's absolutely fine. And it's just like, but Memo, that is entirely in water. What is happening there? The difference is those roots are water roots there. And a lot of the times what will happen is the roots that are hitting into the reservoir at the bottom will start to transition into a bit more of a water root, which means that they can still get the oxygen, because keep in mind the roots up here, they're still more traditional roots and they're getting the oxygen the more traditional way, but then the water roots will be able to get the oxygen from their environment in the way that is easiest for them because they are water roots. So let's touch on something that a lot of people say that, oh, I've struggled with this plant in soil, but actually the moment that I moved it into leca, into pond, I saw great success. This is kind of proving the point there. Whatever oxygen was not available to the plants within that soil media that you had, even if it was the chunkiest of soil medias, it's probably not going to be as chunky as something like leca, perlite, all of these different things, which means that the reason why that didn't do as well in soil versus something in like a semi-hydro element is that potentially that plant is used to having an awful lot of air around its roots. Let me give you the example again of the orchid that I was showing you a moment ago. This is a type of orchid, and I can't remember that. I think this is a ringvola. If not, I'll kind of put the name at the top here. But this, it's got very chunky roots. Think of your Phalaenopsis orchids. And think for a moment, if you didn't have it in something like orchid bark and maybe just had it in pure sphagnum moss, or even worse, in just really dense peaty soil, what was likely going to be to happen? Correct. These roots are used to getting an awful lot of air around them, because actually have a look at some of these orchids when they're growing out in nature, in their tropical environments. And if I find some videos or pictures, I'll add them here. You can kind of see that a lot of times those roots are just hanging in midair, like almost as if the plant is just surviving on the ambient moisture that is happening from the air around it. Now imagine putting something that's used to getting that much air available to it all of the time in something really dense that doesn't have an awful lot of air. That is why a lot of times things might work better in a semi-hydro material versus something that might be in soil, for example. Again, I'll bring up the little Syngonium that I was showing you before, which has got, again, still very kind of airy soil, but this is in a plastic pot, a clear plastic pot. It does have drainage holes at the bottom, but it doesn't have any drainage on the side. The last attempt I'm going to make with this plant is I'm going to put it in something even more airy and put it into a net pot and see what happens. I've got a smaller net pot for this, don't worry. But yeah, that is something that you need to remember. A lot of the times it's the particle size, it's the availability of oxygen, and it's the plant's preferences, or even more specifically, what the plant is used to getting in its natural habitat, especially when it comes to its roots. But how do you make overwatering practically impossible? I'll give you some of my top tips, and I think most of these will make sense based on what I was talking about throughout most of this video. So the big thing is big particle sizes. Remember, we were talking about the particle sizes before. So using something that's exceptionally chunky. There's a lot of people that will just rely on things. I'll give you two very extreme examples. So you can have cocoa peat, which is something that a lot of people are using for houseplants at the moment, and do a 50-50 mix of cocoa peat and perlite. Perlite's very small particles. You're still producing those air gaps within there, but perlite is very small. Try replacing it with something like leca or something like chunky orchid bark, or something that's got a large particle size or a large kind of material, because those will create much bigger gaps. And flip it on its side. Instead of going for something that's a 50-50 mix, go for something that's 60%, 70%, 80% is going to be that chunky big element, and only 10 to 20% is going to be that moisture retaining element. Yes, before anybody says this will also mean that you might need to potentially water your plants a bit more frequently, because they're not going to be able to retain some of that moisture. Again, I will say this time and time again, more overwaterers will kill plants off than underwaterers. The underwatering can still cause its own set of issues, but less so than overwatering. And what these larger particles will do is help people that tend to maybe overwater not cause damage because of the overwatering. Because again, remember, it's not the overwatering that's causing the problem necessarily, it's the lack of oxygen that happens because of the overwatering, because the water might be retaining in the particles for too long, there's not enough kind of gaps, the oxygen exchange can't happen, thus leading to root rot. And this is the thing that surprises a lot of people, because I've mentioned this and I will mention this time and time again. I've always used it as an example for my esmeraldents, which is not looking great at the moment. But again, winter issues, it'll be fine. There's a brand spanking new leaf here that looks particularly healthy, and all the new leaves are completely fine. These leaves that you're seeing here are probably 3 or 4 years old at the moment. They're fine. They've served their purpose. But these massive plants behind me, pot size, maybe a tiny bit bigger than this. Tiny bit bigger than this. Is it telling you something? So go for slightly smaller pot sizes. Yes, it might mean you're going to need to water a bit more often, but sometimes the pot size will mean that you can give a slightly denser soil mix. Please keep the large particles again, and you'll get the best of both worlds there. Don't forget, we talked about this earlier on, refresh your substrate every few years. Don't let just the orchid growers do it. We need to be thinking about refreshing our substrate. Do not always, some plants really do not like their soil being disrupted too much. Do your own research on your specific plant, but also you can refresh that soil media, but actually kind of removing some of it, not all of it, and adding some new, fresher soil media, because then at least the plant roots have got somewhere to go when invariably there's going to be some compaction that might happen on the tiny bit of old media that you've left on there. And then use breathable containers. Use something like a net pot, use something like a terracotta pot, use something like a clear pot with an awful lot of air holes in it. That will definitely help introduce that oxygen into that root area, even if everything else goes wrong. Mechanically, that means that it's a lot more available because it can go through those holes. And then finally, before I go into some final thoughts, let's talk about a quick diagnostic guide on how you kind of look at this and how you can kind of quickly go, oh yes, this is probably what's causing this. So first thing is the soil compacted? Can you see something that was at some point very fluffy and is now very dense? Refresh the soil media at that point. Drainage is another one, and I don't know whether or not, no, I can't move that at the moment, but I've got another plant that has been in its pot for so long, and this is what I mean, even I don't always do this because I don't have the time to do this, but imagine something that has all of these air pockets here, or kind of holes that are happening. Now imagine a plant that's been growing for years, it's been moist, dry, you've got some of that compaction happening, you've got some of that rot that is happening for the substrate, not the roots necessarily. But then also imagine, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, where you get moss coming out of these holes. Guess what that moss has done, in a very large sense there? either entirely block those holes or reduce them to the point where they are no longer functioning to bring in air. So make sure that the air has a way of still coming into the roots of the plant. Look at your pot size. If something is really, really tiny and will probably be a bit swamped in a pot like this, if you have it in a pot this size, it's gonna also be a problem because there's gonna be a whole bunch of media. It doesn't matter how airy it is at that point, it's still gonna remain wet because there's nothing there to use up that moisture within the media. However, something like a net pot, you could kind of get away. It's a bit more forgiving. It won't be because you're going to need to water it more frequently, but it's a bit more forgiving if you've given it a slightly bigger pot, because even if the roots aren't absorbing all the moisture that's there because they're a much smaller root mass in a much bigger pot, the fact that there is this much air and evaporation that's happening from the moisture within these bits of the pot that don't have any roots in them yet, that will still give you a bit of an insurance policy. Yes, I know the problem with a lot of the net pots is that they're obscenely expensive for some bizarre reason. But yes, because I know that they're a lot of the times they're just used for ponds, so it's a captive audience. But if enough of us would buy these, they would come down in price. Yes, they can be messy with soil media. I'm not going to lie to you there. Again, think about the substrate age. How long has the same plant been in the same substrate? I'm not talking about you needed to repot it or not because the plant hasn't become root bound yet, but if a plant is a slow growing plant and it's in exactly the same soil media, which means it's not going to get root bound within 2 or 3 or even 5 years, have you upgraded some of that soil a bit as well? Because again, there's some people going, oh, but like the soil wouldn't update within like nature. Think about it. When we talked about all the debris that's happening on the jungle floor, that element, you might get flash flooding happening, you might get wind. All of these things means that some of the older particles are moved away and then you get more debris. So there is a refreshing that is happening even within nature, and it's happening all the time. And then obviously, ultimately, and this is where it's good to have clear pots or net pots, have a look at your root health. Are there healthy roots in there? Some people might be looking at this going, well, this doesn't look like it's got much going on in there. But yes, and I'm trying to find some of the other roots, but I can show you one there. There is a healthy root that is happening on the side there, and I can see it because I'm using a clear pot. So I'm visually inspecting the root health. So just to recap really quickly, soil compaction, age of the soil, pot size, and root health. These things are going to be the important things that you're going to need to be looking at in order to diagnose what the issue might be, or how and if it is even fixable. So I'm really curious from you now in terms of some of my final thoughts, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. Have you experienced any of this with your own plants? Have you learnt the hard way, which is how most of us learn, actually, ironically enough, is by making some of these mistakes? Do you do any of these adjustments? Has this video been a bit of a reminder of kind of going, oh no, I haven't done that in a while, I should probably go and do that now? Let us all know down below. If you're just new and you're starting off with the hobby, did any of this surprise you? Again, let us all know down below. And I'll leave you with a final, hopefully positive thought, is you don't kill your plant through watering. You can kill it through suffocation, which sometimes is due to the watering, but as you saw throughout this video, there's a whole host of other issues that you need to be taking into consideration, and watering is only part of that equation. But yes, hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.